The rifle shot sent dust flying from the wooden post, just 6 inches from my head. But I didn't flinch. I couldn't. My entire future, what little there was of it, depended on me standing perfectly still while the whole town of Copper Springs stared. It was April of 1875, and I was Hope Miller, 22 years old, and a mail-order bride that nobody wanted. This was my last chance. Sheriff Burke's voice boomed across the dusty town square. Last call! This here mail-order bride needs a husband, or she's on tomorrow's stage back east. His voice was full of pity, which only made it worse. Her intended Walter Jenkins has passed on. God rest his soul. But the fare's been paid. Any man here willing to take her as his lawful wife? My cheeks burned. Humiliation was a fire licking up my neck. Just 2 weeks ago, I'd stepped off that stagecoach in my best dress, clutching a letter from a man who promised me a good, respectable life. A home far away from the stinking tenements of Boston, and even farther from my leering cousin who'd made my life a living hell after my parents died. Instead, I found a town in mourning. Walter Jenkins, the shopkeeper, had died 3 days before I arrived. They said he was trampled by his own horse. Spooked, they said. A horrible accident. The townspeople were kind, I suppose. They put me up at the boarding house. They talked in hushed tones about what to do with me. This public auction, this spectacle of my failure, was their solution. I stared straight ahead at the distant mountains, refusing to meet any of their eyes. The men shuffled their boots in the dirt. They looked at the sky, at the ground, anywhere but at me. I knew I wasn't ugly. I had chestnut hair and my mother's blue eyes. But a strange woman was a risk, a burden. No takers? The sheriff asked, his voice laced with impatience. She can cook and clean. Comes with a small dowry from her late father. A few cruel snickers rippled through the crowd. My heart felt like a stone, sinking into a cold, dark well. Going back to Boston wasn't an option. It was a sentence worse than death. Nobody? The sheriff sighed, getting ready to dismiss me, to cast me out. And then a voice cut through the murmurs. A deep, rough voice that seemed to come from the earth itself. Well then, Miss Miller, the voice said, slow and deliberate. I reckon she's mine. Every head turned. I turned. A tall man was stepping forward from the back of the crowd. He was covered in dust, his face half hidden by a rough beard, but his eyes were as green as summer grass, and they locked onto mine with an intensity that stole the breath from my lungs. The crowd parted for him like he was a king. He walked with a confidence that spoke of hard ground and harder choices. He stopped right in front of the sheriff, but he never looked away from me. She's mine, he repeated, and this time there was a chilling finality in his tone. Forever. The sheriff eyed the stranger, his hand resting near his pistol. And who might you be, mister? The man took off his dusty hat, revealing a mess of sandy hair. Garrett Lawson. I own a cattle ranch, 10 miles north. His gaze was a physical weight pressing down on me. Been meaning to find a wife, he said, his mouth a grim line. Seems like today's the day. I studied him, trying to see past the grime and the beard. He wasn't handsome like the men in Boston. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind. There were lines around his eyes, but they weren't from smiling. This was not a man who laughed often. Miss Miller, the sheriff said, turning to me. Do you accept Mr. Lawson's proposal? My mind was screaming. Walter Jenkins had been a stranger, but he was just words on paper. This man, Garrett Lawson, was flesh and blood and something dangerous. He hadn't asked. He had claimed. But what choice did I have? The stagecoach back to a life of misery, or this dark stranger with the unnerving green eyes? At least he had the courage to step forward when no one else would. Yes, I said, my voice shaking only slightly. I accept. A cheer went up, but it was thin, mostly from relief. The town's problem was solved. I was no longer their burden. I was his. Then by the power vested in me, the sheriff declared, eager to be done with it, I pronounce you man and wife. Make it official with the preacher tomorrow, but this'll do for now. Garrett Lawson gave a single sharp nod. He stepped toward me. Up close, he smelled of leather, horse, and the vast empty prairie. He smelled of loneliness. Got your things? He asked, his voice a low rumble. At the boarding house, I whispered. Let's get them then. He offered me his arm. It was a surprisingly formal gesture from a man who looked like he'd just wrestled a bear. I took it. The muscle beneath his shirt sleeve was hard as rock. As we walked through the town, I could feel every eye on us. I had just married a ghost, a man who appeared from the dust to claim me. I didn't know if he was my savior, or if I had just made the worst mistake of my life. My whole world was packed into a single trunk in a small room at Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house. Some dresses, my mother's Bible, and a little wooden box of sewing supplies. That was it. That's all? Garrett asked. He lifted the heavy trunk as if it were a bag of feathers. Yes, I said, clutching my Bible. I travel light. A flicker of something, approval maybe, crossed his face. Good. It's a long ride. Outside, a sturdy bay horse waited patiently. Garrett secured my trunk behind the saddle with practiced, efficient movements. There was no wasted motion in this man. Can you ride? He asked, turning to me. Not really. In Boston, we walked. He nodded, just once, as if that was the answer he expected. You'll ride with me then. I'll come back for supplies tomorrow. Before I could protest, he lifted me up and settled me on the horse's back. Then he swung up behind me, his body a wall of heat against mine. His arms came around me to take the reins, caging me in. I sat bolt upright, my body rigid, every muscle screaming from the unwanted closeness. Relax, he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. The horse can feel it. I tried to force my shoulders down, but it was impossible. The intimacy was suffocating. As we rode out of Copper Springs, I saw the women on their porches, watching us go. Their faces were a mixture of pity and a strange, morbid curiosity. I lifted my chin, forcing myself to look straight ahead into the wilderness that was supposed to be my new life. We rode in silence for what felt like an eternity. The rhythmic sway of the horse was the only sound, a steady beat marking the minutes of my new, terrifying existence. The land was beautiful, I suppose. Rolling hills and pine trees, splashes of wildflowers. But I couldn't see the beauty. I could only feel the stranger pressed against my back. Why did you do it? I finally asked, my voice thin against the wind. He didn't answer right away. I thought he was going to ignore me. Needed a wife, he said eventually. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Saw an opportunity. An opportunity. Is that all I was? A piece of property to be claimed? A solution to a problem? Is that all? I pushed, a spark of my old Boston fire returning. Am I just an opportunity to you? His chest rumbled against my back. It wasn't quite a laugh. It was something colder. You asking if I'm some kind of scoundrel, Miss Miller? It's Mrs. Lawson, apparently, I snapped back, surprising myself. This time, he did chuckle. It was a low, rough sound that vibrated through me. Fair point. No, I'm not a scoundrel. He paused, and for a moment I thought that was all he was going to say. I need help on the ranch. Been running it alone since my pa died last winter. Then he added something that caught me completely off guard. And no woman should be humiliated like that, standing there while men decide if you're worth the trouble. I didn't know what to say. It was the first hint of anything resembling kindness, and it confused me more than his silence. Thank you for that, at least. Don't thank me yet, he said, his voice hardening again. Ranch life is hard. You might find yourself wishing I'd left you to that stagecoach. I doubt that, I said quietly, the image of my cousin's greedy face flashing in my mind. We crested a hill, and Garrett pulled the horse to a halt. Below us, nestled in a valley, was a ranch. A modest house, a large barn, corrals and pastures where cattle grazed peacefully. A creek wound through the property, its banks lined with cottonwood trees. Lawson Ranch, Garrett said, and for the first time, I heard a sliver of pride in his voice. Not much, but it's mine. Ours now, I suppose. I stared down at my new home. It looked isolated, lonely. The house was simple, but it looked solid, with a porch wrapping around two sides. But something was wrong. Smoke was curling from the chimney. You have help? I asked, my heart thumping. He'd said he was alone. Old Jim. He keeps an eye on things when I'm gone. He was my pa's friend. Lives in the cabin out back. As we rode down the hill, an old man with a shock of white hair came out onto the porch. He watched us approach with sharp, curious eyes. Brought home more than supplies, I see, the old man called out, his voice raspy. Garrett swung down from the horse, then reached up for me. My legs were shaky, and I had to grip his powerful arms to steady myself. For a brief second, we were face to face, and without the shadow of his hat, I could see his eyes more clearly. They were green, yes, but flecked with gold. The eyes of a predator. Jim, this is Hope, Garrett said, stepping back as if my touch had burned him. My wife. The old man's eyebrows shot up to his hairline. Wife? When in thunder did this happen? About 3 hours ago, Garrett said, all business. She was Walter Jenkins's mail-order bride. He died before she got here. Jim's weathered face softened as he looked at me, and for the first time I saw genuine pity. Poor girl. Well, you've landed on your feet, I guess. Even if this one here doesn't know the first thing about treating a lady. He shot Garrett a sharp, disapproving look. Bringing her home without a word of warning, not even a proper wedding. Sheriff Burke married us, Garrett said defensively. That's not a wedding, that's a contract, Jim scoffed. He tipped a non-existent hat to me. Welcome to Lawson Ranch, Mrs. Lawson. I've got stew on. You must be starving. I managed a grateful smile. Thank you, Jim. Please call me Hope. He led us inside. The main room was large, with a stone fireplace big enough to stand in. It was a man's space, functional and sparse. Solid, heavy furniture, no curtains on the windows, no softness anywhere. Doors led off to other rooms shrouded in shadow. It's not fancy, Garrett said from behind me, watching my reaction. But it's solid. The roof doesn't leak. It's lovely, I lied. It felt more like a fortress than a home. The stew was good, and I ate like I hadn't seen food in a week. Jim did all the talking, telling stories about the ranch, about Garrett's father. Garrett himself said almost nothing. He just ate, his green eyes occasionally flicking up to watch me, his expression unreadable, calculating. After dinner, Jim made his excuses and headed out to his cabin, leaving me alone with my new husband. The silence in the room was a living thing. It pressed in on me, heavy and suffocating. I'll show you your room, Garrett finally said, pushing back his chair. He led me to a small bedroom at the back of the house. A simple bed, a dresser, a washstand. The bed was made with a colorful quilt, the only spot of warmth in the entire house. This was my mother's sewing room, he said, his voice oddly tight. I made it a guest room after she passed. He stood awkwardly in the doorway. Never had a guest, though. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I'll sleep in the barn, he said abruptly, until we figure things out. The barn? You don't have to do that. I do, he interrupted, his voice like stone. We're strangers. The sheriff's words don't change that. He looked like he wanted to say more, but he just shook his head. Get some rest. Morning comes early here. And then he was gone. I stood alone in the quiet room, the silence ringing in my ears. I was Mrs. Hope Lawson, the wife of a cattle rancher who was choosing to sleep in a barn rather than under the same roof as me. It wasn't chivalry. I knew that in my bones. It was something else. I unpacked my things, placing my mother's Bible on the nightstand. My fingers trembled as I ran them over the worn leather cover. As I set it down, I noticed something odd. Scratches on the wooden floorboards right by the wall, as if a heavy piece of furniture had been dragged back and forth over and over again. I knelt down, my curiosity overpowering my exhaustion. The scratches led from the wall to the middle of the room, but there was no heavy furniture here now, just the bed, the dresser, the washstand. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a guest room. It was a room that someone had been desperate to search. True to his word, morning came with the first hint of gray light. I woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, and the sound of a man's low voice outside my window. It was Jim. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, worried. I dressed in my plainest dress and went to the main room. Jim was at the stove, his back to me. Good morning, Hope, he said without turning around. Sleep all right? Yes, thank you. I looked around the empty room. Where's Garrett? Up before the sun, Jim said, turning with a plate of eggs. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Calving season. Always busy. Checking on a heifer. He set the plate in front of me. Eat up. You'll need your strength. I appreciated his kindness, but it felt practiced. After breakfast, he showed me around the ranch yard. The water pump, the root cellar, the endless pile of wood that needed chopping. He explained everything with the patience of a schoolteacher. Garrett's a good man, he said, his eyes scanning the horizon. His bark is worse than his bite. Lost his ma young. His pa was a hard man. Not mean, just hard. Didn't teach the boy much about talkin'. It sounded like a speech he'd rehearsed. How long have you known him? I asked. Since he was a boy. Me and his pa, we came west together. We were like brothers. His eyes got a faraway look. I never married. Garrett's the closest thing I have to a son. Just then we heard hoofbeats. Garrett was riding in, leading a second horse piled high with supplies from town. He swung down, his movements sharp and efficient. He didn't look at me. Heifer and calf are fine, he said to Jim. Good. Me and Hope were just getting acquainted, Jim replied a little too cheerfully. I'll get these supplies put away. He took the reins of the second horse and led it toward the barn, leaving Garrett and me standing in another pool of thick, awkward silence. You sleep well? Garrett finally asked, his eyes fixed on the barn door. Yes, thank you. Good. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. He shoved it toward me. Brought you something. I unwrapped it. Inside was a hairbrush with a simple silver handle. It was beautiful. Thank you, Garrett. It's lovely. Noticed you didn't have much, he mumbled, looking embarrassed. Woman at the store helped me pick it. He cleared his throat. There's work to do. Make yourself at home. He turned to leave. Garrett, I called out. He stopped, his back still to me. I could cook dinner tonight. To thank you. And Jim. He looked back over his shoulder, and I saw a flash of surprise on his face. You don't have to. I want to, I insisted. It's one thing I know how to do well. For the first time, the corner of his mouth twitched into something that might have been a smile. All right then, Jim will appreciate that. I spent the day turning that fortress of a house into something that felt a little more like a home. I found a storeroom full of his mother's things, packed away in dusty crates, linens, curtains, even a few potted plants, long dead. As I cleaned, I explored. Every door was open to me except one, a heavy oak door at the end of the hall. It was locked. A thick, sturdy deadbolt, new and freshly oiled, was slid into place. When I asked Jim about it, he got that same evasive look in his eye. Oh, that's just old storage, he said, busying himself with a harness. Rats got in there something awful. Garrett locked it up till he can clear it out. It was another lie. I could feel it. That evening, I made a beef stew that filled the house with a warm, inviting smell. When the men came in, tired and caked with dust, they stopped in the doorway. The table was set. The room was clean. For a moment, Garrett just stared. Smells good, he said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. We ate, and this time, Garrett talked. He asked me about Boston. I told him about my parents, about my life before. I told him why I'd answered Walter Jenkins' advertisement. My cousin was arranging a marriage for me, I explained, to a man twice my age, with 5 children and a cruel streak. Brave of you, Garrett said, his eyes fixed on me. Coming all this way alone. No braver than claiming a stranger for a wife in front of an entire town, I countered. A look passed between us. It wasn't warmth, not yet. It was a flicker of something else. Respect. The days fell into a strange rhythm. Garrett and Jim worked from dawn till dusk. I cooked, I cleaned, I tended a small garden I'd started near the porch. I was slowly chipping away at the coldness of the house, but the coldness in my husband remained. He still slept in the barn. He spoke to me, but his words were guarded. He was always watching. Watching me, watching the horizon, watching the road that led back to town. He was a man waiting for a storm. One evening, Jim had gone to his cabin, and Garrett and I sat on the porch as twilight bled across the sky. My mother would have liked you, he said suddenly, his voice low. He was looking at the flowers I had planted. She always said this place needed a woman's touch. She must have been a wonderful woman, I said, thinking of the quilt on my bed. She was, he said, and a profound sadness filled his eyes. She taught me to read. She loved this land. He fell silent, lost in a memory. Then he looked at me, his gaze sharp and piercing. She died in that room, you know, the one at the back.
Your room. A chill went down my spine. The room with the scratches on the floor. How did she die? I whispered. Fever, he said quickly. Too quickly. It took her fast. Another lie. I knew it. Just like I knew the locked room wasn't full of rats. A week later, a thunderstorm rolled in, fast and violent. I was rushing to get the laundry off the line when Garrett appeared at my side, his hands grabbing the flapping sheets. We ran for the porch just as the sky opened up. We stood there, breathless and damp, watching the rain fall in gray curtains. He reached out and tucked a wet strand of hair behind my ear.
His fingers were rough, calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. It lingered on my skin. My breath caught in my throat. He leaned in closer, his green eyes dark with an emotion I couldn't name. I thought he was going to kiss me. I think I wanted him to. Then a floorboard creaked inside the house. Garrett jerked back as if he'd been shot. His entire body went rigid. He stared at the open doorway, his hand dropping to the pistol he always wore at his hip. The moment of softness was gone, replaced by a deadly stillness. There was no one there. Just the wind, I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. But he didn't relax. Go inside, Hope, he said, his voice a low command. Lock the door behind you. He drew his pistol and stepped off the porch into the pouring rain, moving toward the barn with the silent, lethal grace of a wolf. I did as he said, my hands shaking as I slid the heavy bolt across the door. This wasn't just a ranch, it was a prison. And my husband wasn't a rancher, he was a guard. But what was he guarding? And who, or what, was he so afraid of? The next morning the air was thick with unspoken tension. Garrett announced he was riding into town for supplies. It wasn't a question or an invitation, it was a statement. I'm coming with you, I said. It wasn't a request. He stared at me, his jaw tight. I think he was about to refuse, but something in my expression must have changed his mind. A silent battle of wills passed between us. Fine, he grunted. Get ready. The ride to Copper Springs was silent and stiff. I sat behind him on the horse, my hands resting lightly on his waist, careful not to get too close. The town felt different this time. Before, it had been a place of my humiliation. Now, it felt like enemy territory. As we rode down the main street, I saw Sheriff Burke standing on the boardwalk outside his office. He watched us pass, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He touched the brim of his hat in a mock salute to Garrett. Garrett just stared back, his face a mask of cold fury. The hatred between them was so thick I could taste it. In the general store, people were polite, but their eyes were full of questions. They'd look at me, then at Garrett, then quickly look away. Whispers followed us down the aisles. Garrett treating you all right? Mr. Peterson, the storekeeper, asked me quietly while Garrett was at the back of the store. He's a good man, I said, forcing a smile. Mr. Peterson's own smile faltered. He leaned in closer. Walter Jenkins was a good man too, he whispered, his eyes darting toward the door. A careful man, not the kind to get himself trampled by his own horse, especially not a week after coming into a great deal of money. My blood turned to ice. Money? What money? Sold a claim up in the hills, Peterson muttered, to Garrett's father, right before he got sick. He straightened up as Garrett approached, his face suddenly cheerful and benign. Will that be all for you folks today? On the ride back, my mind was racing. Walter Jenkins had sold a claim to Garrett's father. Then Garrett's father died of a sudden fever. Then Walter Jenkins was trampled by a horse a week after getting paid. And now Garrett was married to me, Walter's intended bride. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern. A trail of bodies. What did Peterson say to you? Garrett asked, his voice sharp. He just asked if I was settling in, I lied. Garrett knew I was lying. I could feel the tension in his back. We rode the rest of the way in a silence that was heavier and more dangerous than ever before. That night, I couldn't sleep. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture I didn't want to see. I thought about the locked room. The key, I realized, must be somewhere Garrett thought I'd never look. I slipped out of bed, my heart pounding. In the main room, a single candle burned on the table. Garrett was gone, probably in the barn, standing guard. I went to his room. It was sparse, even more so than mine. A bed, a dresser. I searched quietly, methodically, under the mattress, in his drawers. Nothing. Then I remembered the loose floorboard under his bed I'd noticed when I was cleaning. I knelt, my fingers finding the edge. I pried it up. Inside the dark space below was a small, locked metal box, and next to it, a single ornate iron key. Not for the box, for a door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely fit the key into the lock of the forbidden room. It turned with a heavy grating sound. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. It wasn't a storage room. It was an office, a man's study. A thick layer of dust covered everything, except for one area on the large oak desk. A perfect, clean rectangle. Something had been there recently. Something that had been put back in its hiding place. The room felt heavy with grief and secrets. On the wall was a portrait of a stern-looking man with Garrett's green eyes, his father. Below it, on a small table, was a framed photograph of a smiling woman with kind eyes, his mother. But it was the desk that drew me in. I ran my fingers over the clean rectangle. A book? A box? I started opening drawers. They were filled with ranching ledgers, bills of sale for cattle, all perfectly normal, except for the last drawer. It was stuck. I pulled harder, and it came open with a groan. Inside, there was only one thing, a daguerreotype. A picture of two young men, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera. One was a younger version of the man in the portrait, Garrett's father. The other was a man I recognized from the general store, a much younger Sheriff Burke. My breath hitched. They were friends. Partners, maybe. What could have happened that would turn friendship into the cold hatred I'd seen in my husband's eyes? I heard a sound from the hallway. A floorboard creaking. I shoved the picture back in the drawer and flew out of the room, pulling the door shut behind me. I had just managed to slide the lock back into place when Garrett appeared at the end of the hall. He stood there, a silhouette against the moonlight from the open front door. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I couldn't sleep. I was getting a glass of water," I stammered, my heart about to beat its way out of my chest. He walked toward me, his boots silent on the wooden floor. He stopped right in front of me, so close I could feel the heat radiating from his body. He didn't look at my face. He looked at the key clutched in my hand. His eyes, green and cold as a winter river, slowly lifted to meet mine. The game was up. "You shouldn't have done that, Hope," he whispered, and the quiet menace in his voice terrified me more than any shout. "Some doors are locked for a reason." He took the key from my trembling fingers. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were filled with a terrible, ancient pain. He looked at the locked door, then back at me. "My father didn't die of a fever," he said, his voice raw. "He was murdered. In this house." The confession hung in the air between us, heavy and poisonous. Murdered. The word echoed in the silent house. "Who?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. "The man he once called a friend. The man who wears a sheriff's badge and owns half the town." Garrett spat, his voice laced with venom. "Sheriff Burke!" He finally looked at me, and for the first time, I saw past the guard, past the cold rancher. I saw a man consumed by a thirst for vengeance. "He and my father were partners years ago. They had a claim together. They found gold." The pieces slammed into place. The money Mr. Peterson mentioned, Walter Jenkins, it was all connected. "Burke wanted it all," Garrett continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "He poisoned my father, made it look like a sickness. He thought no one would ever know. But my father, he was smart. He left me a letter, told me everything." "And Walter Jenkins?" I asked, my own voice shaking. Walter was the only other person who knew the truth. He was a good man, but he was a coward. Burke terrified him. Walter sold his half of the claim to my father, hoping to get enough money to disappear. But Burke couldn't have a loose end. He killed him too, made it look like an accident. He paced the narrow hallway like a caged animal. "I've been waiting, planning, biding my time. I needed proof, something that would stand up." Then he stopped and faced me, his eyes burning with a desperate intensity. "That's why I married you, Hope." My heart shattered. It wasn't pity. It wasn't a flicker of honor. It was a calculation. "What are you talking about?" Walter wrote to me before he died, Garrett explained, his voice urgent. He was terrified. He said he had proof of the murder, proof of the gold claim. He said he was sending it to his mail-order bride for safekeeping. He trusted that no one would ever suspect an innocent woman from Boston. He took a step closer, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. I didn't claim you to save you, Hope. I claimed you because you are the key. Walter sent you the proof, the map to the gold mine, the evidence against Burke. It has to be with you, in your things. Where is it? I was just a tool, a means to an end, a walking, breathing lockbox for his revenge. The humiliation I felt on the auction block was nothing compared to this. I don't have it, I said, my voice cold and empty. I have nothing. You have to, he insisted, grabbing my arms. His grip was like iron. Think, did he send you anything? A package, a book, a locket? Anything? No, just letters, I cried, trying to pull away. Letters about a shop and a new life! His face fell. The fire in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a dawning horror. He had gambled everything on me, and he had lost. He let go of my arms, stumbling back. Then it's gone, he whispered. He must have hidden it somewhere else. Or Burke found it. He looked utterly defeated. The weight of his father's death, of his all-consuming quest for vengeance, seemed to crush him. And in that moment of his utter despair, my mind flashed to the one thing I always kept with me. The one thing I had clutched in my hands when I stepped off that stagecoach. The one thing that felt like home. My mother's Bible. It was old, the leather cover worn smooth with age. But as I thought about it, I remembered something odd. A slight thickness to the back cover. A faint stiffness that had always been there. I had always assumed it was just part of the binding. Wait, I breathed. I ran to my room and grabbed the Bible from the nightstand. Garrett followed me, his eyes wide with a new, fragile hope. My fingers, clumsy and shaking, worked at the inside of the back cover. I found a tiny, loose thread. I pulled. A seam opened up, carefully stitched and hidden. Inside, tucked into a hollowed-out space in the thick cardboard cover, were two things: a folded, yellowed piece of oilskin, and a sworn affidavit, written in my intended's neat, careful hand, detailing everything. How Sheriff Burke had poisoned Garrett's father, how he had threatened Walter, forcing him to keep quiet. It was all there, the proof Garrett had been searching for. I handed him the affidavit. His hands shook as he read it, his face a storm of grief and vindication. Then I unfolded the oilskin. It was a map, a hand-drawn map of the Lawson Ranch, with a crude X marking a spot deep in the rocky canyons at the northern edge of the property. Below it were the words, "The heart of the mountain." He did it, Garrett whispered, his voice choked with emotion. The old fox, he actually did it. We had it. We had the proof. We had the location of the mine. We had everything we needed to destroy Sheriff Burke. But as I looked from the map to Garrett's face, a cold dread washed over me. Burke wasn't a man who would let a fortune and a murder charge slip through his fingers. He had killed twice already. He wouldn't hesitate to kill again. He had let me come to the ranch. He had watched me marry Garrett. He wasn't ignoring me. He was waiting. He was waiting for me to lead him right to the evidence. And now we had found it. Suddenly, a dog started barking frantically outside. A sharp, terrified sound that was cut off with a sickening yelp. Garrett's head snapped up. He looked at me, his eyes wide with alarm. "He's here," he breathed. A heavy fist pounded on the front door, making the whole house shake. "Lawson!" Sheriff Burke's voice boomed through the wood. It was no longer friendly or mocking. It was the voice of a predator that had cornered its prey. "I know she's in there. I know what she has. Send out the girl and the map, and I might let you and the old man live." Garrett didn't hesitate. He moved with a speed and purpose that was terrifying. He grabbed a rifle from a rack on the wall and shoved it into my hands. "Hope, listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent, his hands gripping my shoulders. "You know how to use this. I showed you." "What are you going to do?" I cried. "Jim's in the cabin out back. Burke won't have seen him. I'm going to draw their fire. When I do, you run. You run for the canyons. Follow the creek bed. It will give you cover. Don't stop for anything. You hear me? Don't stop. I'm not leaving you. You have to," he roared, his face inches from mine. "The proof is everything. If we die, he wins. Everything my father worked for, everything he died for, it'll all be for nothing. Now go! He shoved me toward the back of the house, toward the small window in the kitchen that looked out over the creek. Another crash came from the front of the house, the sound of the door splintering. Go! Now! Garrett yelled. He turned and ran toward the front of the house, firing his pistol into the darkness. I scrambled out the kitchen window, landing hard in the muddy creek bank below. Gunshots exploded behind me, shattering the night. I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, my lungs burning, tears streaming down my face. I clutched the map and the affidavit in my hand, the paper growing slick with my sweat. I could hear shouting, more gunshots, the sounds of a desperate battle. I didn't look back. I just followed the creek, deeper and deeper into the dark, rocky canyons, just like Garrett had told me. The future of the Lawson Ranch, the truth of his father's murder, it was all in my hands. I was no longer an opportunity or a tool. I was the only hope left. The canyons were a maze of rock and shadow. I stumbled through the darkness, the sounds of the gunfight growing fainter behind me. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent a fresh wave of terror through me. Burke's men could be anywhere. I finally found a small cave, little more than a crevice in the rock face, and squeezed inside. I huddled in the cold, damp darkness, trying to control my ragged breaths. I was alone, utterly and completely alone. Had I done the right thing, running while Garrett and Jim fought for their lives? The thought was a knife in my gut, but Garrett's words echoed in my head. If we die, he wins. He had entrusted me with the proof, with his father's legacy. I couldn't fail him. I must have huddled there for hours. The sky began to lighten from black to a bruised purple. The silence from the ranch was absolute. It was a dead silence that terrified me more than the gunshots. I had to know. I crept out of the cave, moving from rock to rock, my rifle held tight against my chest. It took me almost an hour to make my way back to the edge of the valley where I could see the ranch house. And my heart stopped. The front door was hanging off its hinges. The windows were shattered, but there were no bodies, no sign of a struggle, and something was wrong with the barn. The large doors were wide open. Smoke was drifting from the small cabin where Jim lived. I ran down the hill, my fear giving way to a desperate, frantic energy. The main house was empty, trashed, tables overturned, drawers pulled out. They had been looking for me. I ran to Jim's cabin. The door was ajar. I pushed it open. Jim was lying on the floor. I rushed to his side, dropping to my knees. There was a dark stain spreading across his chest. His eyes were open, but they were glassy, staring at the ceiling. Jim, I whispered, my voice breaking. His head turned slowly. A flicker of life returned to his eyes. Hope, he rasped, a bloody froth on his lips. Don't talk, I sobbed, trying to staunch the bleeding with a piece of my skirt. I'll get help. Too late for that, girl, he coughed. Listen to me. He gripped my wrist with a surprising strength. They took him, Burke and his men. They took Garrett. My blood ran cold. Where? The mine, Jim wheezed, his breath growing shallow. Burke couldn't find the map. He thinks Garrett knows where it is. He's going to try and force it out of him. He coughed again, a racking, painful sound. He's wrong. Garrett doesn't know, only his pa did. Only the map knows. His eyes were starting to lose focus. You have to save him, girl. Don't let that monster win. His grip on my wrist loosened. His head fell back against the floorboards. Jim, I shook him gently. Jim, but he was gone. A wave of grief and rage washed over me. They had killed this kind old man, and they had my husband. I stood up, my body trembling. I looked down at the map clutched in my hand. The heart of the mountain. Garrett had no idea where it was. Burke was torturing him for information he didn't have. He would kill him. I was the only one who could save him. I ran to the barn. My horse, the gentle mare Garrett had taught me to ride, was gone. They must have taken her. But Garrett's stallion, a big, powerful beast he called Thunder, was still there, pacing nervously in his stall. He was wild, difficult. Garrett was the only one who could handle him. I had no choice. I threw Garrett's saddle on the stallion's back, my hands moving with a purpose I didn't know I possessed. The horse fought me, rearing and snorting, but I talked to him, my voice low and steady. using the same words I'd heard Garrett use. Somehow I got the saddle cinched. I jammed the rifle into the scabbard. I pulled myself up, my muscles screaming in protest. I took the reins, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Okay, Thunder," I whispered, leaning forward. "Let's go get our boy back." I dug my heels into his sides, and we exploded out of the barn, leaving the scene of death and destruction behind us. I followed the map, racing toward the rocky canyons, toward the heart of the mountain. I was no longer Hope Miller, the unwanted bride from Boston. I was Mrs. Lawson, and I was coming to save my husband. The ride was brutal. Thunder was a force of nature, powerful and barely controlled. He leaped over rocks and gullies that would have crippled a lesser horse. I just held on, my body battered, my focus narrowed to a single point, the X on the map. As I got closer, I heard voices, angry, frustrated voices echoing off the canyon walls. I dismounted, tying Thunder to a twisted pine tree. I crept forward on foot, my rifle in my hand, my heart in my throat. I peered over a rocky ledge and saw them. It was the entrance to an old, abandoned mine shaft, shored up with rotting timbers. 3 of Burke's men stood guard outside, and tied to one of the timbers, slumped and bleeding, was Garrett. His face was bruised and swollen, his shirt torn. But he was alive. His head was bowed. But as I watched, he lifted it, glaring at Sheriff Burke with pure, unadulterated hatred. "I'll ask you one last time, Lawson," Burke sneered, pressing the barrel of his pistol against Garrett's temple. "Where is it? Where's the gold?" "Go to hell," Garrett spat, his voice raspy. Burke laughed, a cold, ugly sound. "Oh, I'm already there, but I plan on being a rich man when I arrive. Now, you can tell me, or I can start shooting pieces off your pretty new wife when I find her. And I will find her." My hands tightened on my rifle. Rage, cold and clean, burned away my fear. I had the element of surprise. They were focused on Garrett. They didn't know I was here, but there were 4 of them. I was only one. A frontal assault was suicide. I looked around frantically. My eyes fell on Thunder. The horse was still pulling at his reins, agitated by the strange voices. An idea, a crazy, desperate idea sparked in my mind. Garrett had told me about his father, how he had been a clever man, always thinking 2 steps ahead. The mine wasn't just a hole in the ground, it was a place he knew, a place he might have prepared. I looked at the rotting timbers above the mine entrance. They were old, brittle, holding back tons of loose rock and dirt. I crept back to Thunder and untied him. I slapped his rump, hard. "Go!" I yelled. The stallion, startled and angry, bolted. He charged straight toward the mine entrance, a whirlwind of panicked horseflesh. "What in the hell?" one of Burke's men yelled. They were all distracted, turning to see the charging stallion. It was the opening I needed. I raised my rifle, took a steadying breath, and aimed high, not at the men, at the rotting timbers above the mine entrance. I fired. The shot echoed through the canyon. The bullet splintered the main support beam. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a deep groan, the entire structure gave way. Tons of rock and earth cascaded down, sealing the entrance to the mine in a massive landslide. Burke and his men were momentarily stunned, staring at the wall of rock that had just blocked their path to a fortune. I used their shock. I fired again, this time at the man closest to Garrett. He cried out and fell, clutching his leg. "It's the girl!" another man shouted, turning and firing wildly in my direction. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks around me, sending chips of stone flying. I ducked back behind the ledge, my heart hammering. It was happening. It was really happening. "Find her!" Burke roared. "I want her alive!" 2 of his men started climbing the rocks, coming for me. I was trapped. But the landslide had done more than just seal the mine. It had given Garrett an opportunity. In the chaos, he had been working on his ropes. With a sudden, powerful surge, he snapped the frayed rope that held him. He lunged for the gun dropped by the man I'd shot in the leg. "Burke!" Garrett roared. The sheriff spun around, his face a mask of shock. Just as Garrett fired, the shot caught Burke in the shoulder, sending him staggering back. Now it was 2 against 2. Garrett, using the mine supports as cover, exchanged fire with Burke. I was pinned down by the other 2 men climbing toward me. I knew I couldn't hold them off for long. I looked around, my eyes searching for any advantage. I saw a pile of loose rocks, precariously balanced on the edge of the ledge above where the men were climbing. It was a long shot. I scrambled over to the rocks, holstering my rifle. I put my shoulder against the largest boulder and pushed with all my might. It teetered, then rolled, dislodging the rest of the pile. A small avalanche of rocks tumbled down the cliff face. The men below shouted in alarm, trying to scramble out of the way, but they were too late. The rocks swept them off their feet, sending them crashing to the canyon floor below. I looked down. The battle between Garrett and Burke was reaching its climax. Both men were out of bullets. Burke lunged at Garrett with a knife. They wrestled in the dirt. A desperate, brutal fight for survival. Burke was bigger, but Garrett was fueled by years of rage. He managed to get the upper hand, pinning Burke to the ground. He raised the knife, the sun glinting off the steel. "This is for my father!" he yelled. "Wait!" I screamed, sliding down the scree slope. Don't become him!" Garrett froze, his arm tensed, the knife held high. He looked at me, his chest heaving, his face a mess of blood and dirt and fury. He looked at the man gasping for air beneath him, the man who had taken everything from him. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the knife. He stood up, breathing heavily. "No," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "You're not worth it. You'll stand trial. You'll rot in a cell for what you did." He had won. Not just the fight, but the war within himself. He turned to me, and the look in his eyes made my heart ache. He stumbled toward me, pulling me into his arms. He held me so tightly I could barely breathe. "You came back?" he whispered into my hair. "I told you to run." "You're my husband," I whispered back, my voice muffled against his chest. "I wasn't going to leave you." We stood there for a long moment, clinging to each other in the silent canyon. The fight was over. Justice, real justice, was finally within reach. We took Burke and his surviving men back to town. The story came out, backed by Walter's affidavit. The whole territory was shocked. The corrupt sheriff, the hidden gold, the tale of murder and revenge. Garrett Lawson became a hero. But more importantly, he became my husband. Truly, my husband. The night after we got back to the ranch, he didn't go to the barn. He moved his things into the main bedroom. He took my hand, his calloused fingers lacing through mine. "When I claimed you in that square," he said, his green eyes soft and full of a light I'd never seen before, "I told myself it was for revenge. I told myself you were just a means to an end." He shook his head, a small, sad smile on his face. "I was lying to myself. The moment I saw you, standing there so proud and defiant, refusing to be broken, I knew. I think I knew even then." He raised my hand to his lips and kissed my knuckles. "You saved me, Hope. In every way a person can be saved. The gold from the mine made us wealthy, but we didn't change our lives much. We rebuilt the house. We hired more hands. We made the Lawson Ranch a place of life and laughter, not secrets and sorrow. The following spring, I gave birth to a son. We named him James, after the brave old man who had been more of a father to Garrett than his own. He had his father's green eyes, and, I like to think, his mother's stubborn spirit. Sometimes, when the sun sets over the mountains, Garrett and I sit on the porch, and he'll take my hand. We don't have to say anything. We both remember that day in the town square. How two strangers, bound by death and desperation, found a love that was stronger than any revenge and richer than any gold. I came west looking for a home, and I found one. But it wasn't the house or the land. It was in the heart of a man who claimed me when I had nothing, and who I, in turn, claimed back from the darkness. What started as a desperate bargain became the greatest adventure of our lives. If you enjoyed this story and believe that hope can be found in the most unexpected places, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales of justice and survival from the Old West.